For 13 years, under the banner of Operation Cyclone, the United States gave weapons and training to Islamic rebel groups as they fought to overthrow the Soviet Union-backed Afghanistan government. Trained by the CIA, the Afghan mujahideen rose to become a global jihadist threat whose legacy still impacts the Middle East to this day. Some experts even believe that this mission led to the attacks on the World Trade Center on September the 11th, 2001. Today we're going to explore how the CIA's Operation Cyclone backfired in the worst possible ways. Afghanistan's communist takeover. Deep within the United States Central Intelligence Agency lies the Special Activities Division, responsible for paramilitary and covert operations. Since 1948, the CIA's Special Activities Division has been influencing regime change across the globe. This division remains active to this very day, but one campaign stands out among the rest. In 1979, the CIA began one of its longest-running and most expensive projects, Operation Cyclone. 1 year prior, on the 27th of April 1978, Nur Mohammad Taraki led a band of revolutionaries to seize control of Afghanistan. Taraki began his career writing as a journalist, but before long he served as the founder and general secretary of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. Despite the name, the PDPA was a communist group that overthrew the previous government and established the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Soon after it was established, the DRA signed a pact with the Soviet Union, and Taraki's extremist Khalq faction began carrying out mass executions. The Khalq faction targeted conservative religious leaders from the Parcham faction and redistributed land to the revolutionaries who supported the new communist regime. In response to the civil bloodshed, the Afghan mujahideen rose up to rebel against the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and the Soviet Union who backed them. However, not even a year later, Taraki was overthrown by Hafizullah Amin. Amin was not part of the moderates nor the mujahideen rebels. Instead, Amin seized control to exact even worse human rights violations than his predecessor. His crimes shocked the world, as well as the Soviet Union that helped him rise to power. The Russian KGB had woven their way into the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, but Amin grew paranoid at the thought of foreign interference and began severing ties with the Soviets, who originally enabled the communist takeover. The Soviets suspected Amin had to be a CIA plant because he was upending the work of Taraki, and they took this threat more seriously than the US predicted. Around this time, Pakistan began talks with the US. Tensions were high because of Pakistan's own political turmoil and because of the continuation of their controversial nuclear program. But the Carter administration was still reeling from the Cuban Missile Crisis decades prior, meaning that Pakistan was the lesser of the two evils. To prevent the Soviet Union from gaining influence in the Middle East, Carter sought the special clandestine skills of the CIA's Special Activities Division. Various officials from the US Department of Defense, the CIA, and the National Security Council weighed the options before them. On the one hand, a covert operation in Afghanistan could lead to the Soviet Union getting mired in a Vietnam-style conflict, but it could also provoke the Soviet Union to engage in more direct combat that could culminate in increased military presence and an expanded Soviet control. Operation Cyclone sows the seeds of war. The US decided to work with Pakistan. Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Department would serve as the middleman between the US and Afghan mujahideen rebels. CIA operatives started meeting with various rebel leaders, including Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was a faction leader and drug trafficker that later became infamous for his role in the conflict. After various meetings with the Mujahideen, President Carter signed permits for the CIA to spend $695,000 to support the Islamic rebels. The money was allotted for non-military aid, and it was also used for a propaganda campaign highlighting the role of Soviet KGB members inside the newly formed Afghan government. This propaganda campaign was far more effective than the CIA or Carter could have imagined. It sent the paranoid Amin into a frenzy. In his disarray, he lost control of the government, and the Soviet Union took the option that critics of the plan had feared. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, executed Amin, and re-established their puppet government with Babrak Karmal at the helm. Karmal was the leader of the moderate Parcham faction of the DRA. The Soviets saw the strategic potential in installing him as the new president of Afghanistan, since his stance would contrast the harsh, psychopathic reign of Amin, which would help win the people over and prevent further dissent. However, this was only the beginning of the horrors that lay in wait for the Afghan people. The Soviet-Afghan War had just begun. Instead of the CIA making it harder for the Soviet Union to take control, the plan backfired. The CIA and the Carter administration now had to contend with a greater threat: full Soviet control of Afghanistan, which would disrupt oil supplies and possibly serve as a stepping stone for further expansion. The US would later take this fear to extremes, which would serve as the foundation for their policies with Pakistan and Iran. If the Afghanistan guerrilla fighters fell to the Soviets, then the US would have to be ready to disrupt the governments of both Iran and Pakistan to reduce the impact of a Soviet-controlled Afghanistan. In response to the invasion, Carter signed the Carter Doctrine, which stated the US would use military force if necessary in the Persian Gulf. He called for a boycott of the 1980s Summer Olympics, due to be held in Moscow. He also announced new sanctions on the Soviet Union. The CIA's early strategy in Operation Cyclone relied on the mujahideen carrying out a guerrilla-style war in Afghanistan. To achieve this goal, the CIA provided logistics, broad military tactics, weapons, and combat training to rebel fighters. To cloak their involvement prior to the Soviet invasion, the CIA procured Soviet-based weapons from Israel, which had a stockpile of Soviet arms the country captured during the Ramadan War in 1973. Since the Soviets backed the DRA, the presence of their weapons in rebel hands wouldn't raise alarm bells of foreign interference. However, this obfuscation technique was only used prior to the invasion. Once the Soviet invasion commenced and the Carter Doctrine was signed, the US officially began supporting the mujahideen with weapons, opening up avenues for a broader variety of arms shipments. The Stinger anti-aircraft missile system turned the tides thanks to their mobility and combat effectiveness. A single Stinger could take out Soviet personnel carriers to prevent the rebels from being overwhelmed in strategic locations. Britain's own intelligence agency MI6 also provided weapons to the Mujahideen fighters, including old 1895 Lee Enfield bolt-action rifles, landmines, and 50 blowpipe man-portable air defense systems. Saudi Arabia pledged to match the expenditure of the US to further support the effort. After Carter left office, Reagan went all in on Operation Cyclone, boosting the total budget from a modest $695,000 to a staggering $3 billion in support of the Afghan rebels. The CIA's effort to train the Mujahideen was aided by funding from Saudi Arabia and the People's Republic of China. Britain's MI6 also helped with the training, and together the conglomerate helped Pakistan to craft a program that trained roughly 17,000 Mujahideen fighters every year. To further assist in the operation, Pakistan and the CIA worked to convince volunteers to join the effort and resist the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Over time, the CIA became increasingly bold in showcasing its involvement in Afghanistan. The CIA Director William Casey personally traveled to Pakistan on multiple occasions to oversee Operation Cyclone. In 1985, the White House Conference hosted the Mujahideen commander Yunus Khalis. There, Khalis met with Reagan and invited the president to convert to Islam. Despite numerous miscalculations by the CIA, Operation Cyclone effectively succeeded on July 20, 1987. when Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan. In 1988, the Geneva Accord brought a more diplomatic end to the conflict, and experts believe the Soviet losses in Afghanistan contributed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, beginning that same year and continuing until 1991, when the final Union country left. In the end, over 50,000 Soviet soldiers were wounded in the Afghan conflict, and 14,000 were killed or remain missing in action. Cyclone, a storm with serious blowback. Once the Soviets left Afghanistan, Operation Cyclone halted all payments and shipments to the rebels. The operation seemed like a success, but America had yet to witness the blowback, or unintended consequences of their involvement in Afghanistan. The administration of George Bush Sr. unmade much of the diplomatic progress that the US had gained with Pakistan, after the president refused to certify that the country did not possess nuclear weapons. In 1991, funding of the mujahideen continued with an additional $200 million. The decision to trust Pakistan with distributing aid and weapons proved to be a catastrophic failure for Operation Cyclone. Over the course of the operation, the US continued to pump money and weapons into the financial center of the country in Karachi. However, once there, corrupt officials sold many of the weapons on the black market instead of delivering them to the mujahideen. The influx of weapons and illicit trade created a huge surge in violent crime and murder. For a time, Karachi was considered the deadliest city in the world, and it remained notorious for over 30 years. Even by 2014, it was still considered the sixth most dangerous city in the world. Operation Cyclone was further complicated by cultural and political divisions within the Afghan mujahideen. The group of rebels was divided into two major alliances. The first was called the Tehran 8, which was comprised of the Hazara ethnic group based out of Iran. The second major alliance was based out of Pakistan and called the Peshawar 7. The two groups were also divided on religious lines. The Tehran 8 followed the Shia Islamic tradition, while the Peshawar 7 followed Sunni Islam. Sunni Islam is the largest Islamic denomination in the world, comprising between 85 to 90% of the world's total Muslim population. The Peshawar 7 was also a larger group in terms of total members. Because the Peshawar 7 were based in Pakistan and had ideals more closely aligned with the government of Pakistan, the Peshawar 7 received the majority of the arms that weren't sold on the black market. As the name suggests, the Peshawar 7 were further split into 7 smaller groups, and 4 of these groups held extreme Islamic fundamentalist beliefs that would later be shared by various terror groups, leading many to believe the funding and training of these groups directly led to the rise of the new militant extremist groups in the Middle East. To make matters worse, the stingers supplied to the guerrilla fighters were so effective that the United States had to issue a buyback program to prevent the stingers from falling into enemy hands, which could disrupt future missions in other countries. One of the more prominent figures of the mujahideen, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, was another extremely controversial figure, and he is possibly the worst example of blowback from Operation Cyclone. Hekmatyar received the bulk of the moral and political support from Pakistan, along with a large amount of the overall weapons and aid packages. This would later spark outrage, since Hekmatyar was shown to have killed civilians and other mujahideen fighters. One of his most brutal betrayals resulted in 2,000 civilian deaths when his group attacked the city of Kabul. Hekmatyar used American funding and weapons to advance his own heroin smuggling business as well, making him one of the leading drug lords in the region. But worst of all, Hekmatyar was believed to have close ties with Osama bin Laden, who founded one of the most notorious terror groups of all time, the group that was directly responsible for the attacks on September the 11th, which killed 2,977 people on US soil and injured roughly 25,000 people. Beyond the obvious mistake of empowering Hekmatyar, the CIA has amassed a slew of accusations about its possible role in indirectly funding Al-Qaeda. marking a dark end to the CIA's operation in Afghanistan. Conclusion. That's the dark secret behind the blowback from Operation Cyclone. It started as a covert operation to assist rebels to disrupt Soviet control in Afghanistan, and would become one of the most controversial and tragic miscalculations the US has ever made. If you enjoyed the video, or if you learned something new, you can make the non-controversial decision to support the channel by clicking the like button and subscribing for more geopolitical videos just like this one. Hit the bell to get notified because you won't want to miss what's coming up next.